Good evening, my fellow Americans. My name is Anthony Catella, one of the candidates for the congressional nomination for Illinois 14. But tonight, I don't want to focus on the campaign. I want to celebrate President's Day with you all and to talk a little bit about the presidents and the presidency of the United States on this President's Day. And this is a talk I wrote some years ago, and I want to re-deliver it to you tonight. Let us consider the chief executive of the greatest nation in the history of the world, the presidency of the United States. The president is a person to whom it becomes the duty to fulfill the office, but the presidency is the institution that was founded by our founding fathers and written into the Constitution of the United States. Our presidents come and go, but the presidency belongs to the people and perdures and endures throughout the history of this great country of ours. We must understand this great institution. The presidency is an institution. Most Americans don't have a good conception of the American presidency. I studied it in college. It was one of the courses I took in college. The presidency is unique as an office in the history of the world. There was no office of its kind ever before, and it is today most unique among the rulers of this world's governments. The modern president occupies a preeminent position in our country and the world. Not all of our presidents have been world leaders. James Monroe first pointed our country in the direction of world leadership. But then we turned inward. 100 years after President Monroe came Woodrow Wilson, and he was president 100 years ago. He really began to shape our country as a world leader as he led us to victory in the First World War, which we were in 100 years ago. Well, actually, 100 years ago, it was now all but over. It was over, and Woodrow Wilson was not very well and was a rather sick man in the White House. And we had passed through a very glorious but trying time in our country's history under his leadership. But every president since Woodrow Wilson, excepting the three presidents after him, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, they were good men, has had the duty to bear not only national but world responsibilities. During Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover's presidencies, the nation retreated into isolationism. During the years 1921 to 1933, the president concerned himself with domestic matters, but every president since Franklin D. Roosevelt, over 70 years ago, has been the leader not only of the United States, but of all the free nations of the world that look to us to be a part of an enduring endeavor to preserve peace and guard freedom. When a president leaves office, he is still respected and expected to maintain his interests in political affairs. He is still the head of his political party until another president of his party succeeds him. A former president is no longer head of state. Only the sitting president is the head of state, as well as the head of the government and commander-in-chief of our armed forces. The former president still has the honor of the title Mr. President, unless the current president is in his presence. Then only is the current president of higher rank and addressed, as always, Mr. President. Never has there been a president who did not still represent the office after he left it. The presidency, said Herbert Hoover, is more than an administrative office. It must be the symbol of American ideals. It must be the instrument by which national conscience is leavened. The presidency is not an ordinary prize, nor a normal object of ambition. It is the greatest office in the world. We can say that now because of our country's role in the world. The United States since 1945 has occupied a preeminent position in the world. That is why the presidency is the greatest office in the world. We did not start out as the world's greatest power. We rose over time to that preeminence. We have no promise from Providence that our greatness will endure, but we are allowed by him to be the leader of the free world by the sweat, strength, and spirit we bring to our national life. If we are to maintain and remain the leader of the world, then we must understand what we have as our heritage of liberty and what we have to do to keep it. One thing is for sure. We must not take our liberty for granted. The day we do is the day we lose it, and then we can just forget the whole thing, or spend our twilight years recalling what we once had. I would rather die fighting for my liberty and freedom and my heritage than die wishing I'd still had it. Each generation of Americans must be interested in the welfare of the nation with as much devotion as the previous generation in order to keep our heritage of liberty and self-government alive. The presidency is the office that keeps us free because everyone who ever occupied it or ever will occupy it is him or herself a free citizen of this republic. The president is the person who acts to maintain our country. The president is the custodian, guardian of our country, and he or she leads all the members of our government and the nation under the Constitution. There is not a ruling class or family in America. It is every citizen who in some small way is a part of our whole country. We have a home and a country. We did not get it for nothing. We won it through sweat, blood, toil, and tears. We won it in a war for independence, and we preserved it in a war that divided us between North and South. It is our turn to make ready to maintain our form of government written down in the Constitution of the United States. The presidency is described in Article 2, Sections 1 through 4 of the Constitution of the United States. The President of the United States has several duties he must meet. The first job of the President is as Chief Executive of the government, with order to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The President represents the entire country. He is the only man who speaks for the 160 million people who are the citizens of this land. There are many interests competing in the government, but we are still a people of one nation and one government. The President is the leader who speaks for all of the people, no matter from what part of the country they may be, no matter what their political persuasion may be. All of us have our rights under the law, and the President makes sure the rights of the people are protected and respected. The very fact that the President is the chief executive means it is necessary for him to understand the nation, its relationship with other nations, and the relationship we have between our fellow citizens here at home. The purpose for which the President is elected is to lead the nation. The nation is composed of all kinds of citizenry who associate together in their various groups, but are, because of a united spirit, fellow Americans all. The American people is who the President comes from, and who the President leads, and to whom he will return. The President must be a good politician who understands the operation of government. Most of our presidents have come up from the political ranks, but some were from other professions, such as the military. The man who is president today has made history by becoming the first president who never held any previous political office and was never really a member of either political party. The last president of this kind was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who served as our 34th president from 1953 to 1961. It is, or should be, a great honor to be in politics. We are all in politics because we are all fellow citizens of the Great Republic. The Great Republic is another way of referring to the United States of America. All of our presidents, who we revere as great, had an understanding of human nature. They knew the good and the bad side. They tried to exalt the good and correct the bad as best they could. 200 years ago, James Monroe was our president, and he presided over the era of good feeling, because almost all the people from 1817 to 1825 showed the good side of their human nature. But it is not always that way in government. But the goal is always to try to make everyone happy. It is not an easy goal, and sometimes the president succeeds in this. Most times he doesn't. For many years in our own time, we've suffered from gridlock in government due to the friction between our two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. The second duty or task of the president is to be the commander-in-chief of all the armed forces of the United States. He is the absolute commander of the armed forces of the United States, especially in time of war. The powers of the president have historically expanded in time of war. Those examples are Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, Woodrow Wilson 100 years ago during the First World War, and Franklin D. Roosevelt during World War II. Throughout the Cold War, 1945 to 1991, the American president had vast powers and presided over two major wars, the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, and the Vietnam War, 1960 to 1975. The Vietnam War, 50 years ago, was so long and devastating that during its time, one president was assassinated, one driven from re-election, and another forced to resign. It can be argued that Richard Nixon's resignation was not due to Vietnam, but to the Watergate scandal. Since September 11, 2001, with our new longest war to fight, our presidents have had to bring forth continual vigilance and ingenuity to their role as commander-in-chief. It is the president's job to outline our military policy with help from the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Armed Forces. The President appoints generals and all the officers of the United States. The President, as leader of the nation and all free nations of the world, makes the foreign policy of the United States. This is the plan of action for our country in the world, and it guides how the United States acts towards friend and foe alike. The objective of the American foreign policy is to maintain peace and freedom for our benefit and for the benefit of the peoples of the earth. President Truman spoke in his inaugural address of 1949. The peoples of the earth look to the United States as never before for strength, goodwill, and wise leadership. President Truman's foreign policy was one of the best of our modern presidents, with the Marshall Plan, named for his Secretary of State, George Marshall, also a great World War II general. It was called the European Recovery Program, but it was given the name of George Marshall, who introduced it in a speech to the Harvard graduating class in 1947. We rebuilt Germany and the devastated European continent, and he deputized Douglas MacArthur to oversee the reconstruction of Japan. NATO was the coalition of European states that formed the defense against communism. The United Nations began its ongoing task to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Truman did a lot in the area of foreign policy. In the Middle East, he signed the UN Charter, creating the modern state of Israel. The president is in charge of foreign relations with other sovereignties. He appoints ambassadors to foreign states with the advice and consent of the Senate. The U.S. ambassador represents the president and the United States in the various states to which they are assigned. A U.S. embassy on foreign soil anywhere in the world is an extension of the United States territory. The president also receives foreign ambassadors from other countries. He must do this, or they have to return to their own country. In extreme cases, when an ambassador is ordered to leave, what follows is diplomatic relations are broken, and usually war comes as a result. And one case in point is back in February 1917, when Count von Bernstorff of Germany was ordered home because Germany refused to end its unrestricted submarine warfare against Allied ships. This was one of the key causes that led Congress to declare war on Germany upon the recommendation of President Woodrow Wilson. The president has a group of advisors that head each of the main departments of government. He has to know what they are doing, and they advise him on policy matters and crisis situations. But it is the president alone who must make the decision as he sees fit in the light of a broad experience with history. History, men, and nations. A presidential decision is one of the loneliest experiences of the presidency. It is lonely because it is only the president who makes this decision, and no one else can do the deciding for him. That is his job. His decision must always reflect the best interests of the United States, the people who elected him or her, and the people who depend upon their president to keep them safe and free. Examples of some presidential decisions from history: Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase, Jackson and the Bank of the United States, Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, Chester Arthur and Civil Service Reform, Presidents Woodrow Wilson and Franklin D. Roosevelt and their decisions to go to war, Truman and the atomic bomb, relief of MacArthur, Eisenhower and his decision to invade Lebanon, Kennedy and his decision to let the Berlin Wall alone and not go to war, Reagan and his decision to invade Grenada, Bush 41 and his decision to defend Kuwait, Bush 43 and his decision to go to war in Afghanistan and later in Iraq, to name a handful. The Secretary of State is the President's chief advisor on foreign policy. As stated, the cabinet secretaries advise the President, but he alone makes the decisions on domestic and foreign policy matters. To illustrate this, President Truman had a sign on his Oval Office desk which read, "The buck stops here." He can't pass the buck to anybody, he would say, after nearly 8 years of decision-making, when he delivered his farewell address to the nation in January 1953. The first article of the Constitution defines the legislative branch of the government, but the President is also one of the legislators of the government in the sense that Article 2, Section 3 declares, "The President shall from time to time give to the Congress information of the state of the Union, and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient." In the modern era, the President has lived out this constitutional allowance with bold legislative proposals for the country, as in Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal to combat the economic depression, John Kennedy's New Frontier, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society for the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson once described the presidency this way: "You take an oath, you step into an office, and you must then help guide a great democracy." A president does not shape a new and personal vision of America. He collects it from the scattered hopes of the American past. It has guided us every step of the way. It sustains every president, and it shall lead us into the 3rd century of the search for a more perfect union. We today are now in the 3rd century of the American Union, a union of 50 free sovereign states led by our president, who truly tries to speak to vast segments of the populace, east and west, north and south, and to help us find a way toward a more perfect union and a more fruitful life for all Americans in all America. All of us together must help to forge answers to the great questions of our time. The answers come slowly in our deliberation of government, but they do come, and they are proclaimed in the voice of we the people. The president is the head of his political party. Sometimes the president is a Democrat, as in Jimmy Carter. Sometimes he is a Republican, as in Ronald Reagan, or now our current chief executive, Donald Trump. The president must lead his party and find cooperation with members of the opposition party. This is key to governing. The genius of our government is in compromising between various or opposite points of view. Our very Constitution developed from a compromise plan between representation of larger states and smaller states. It was the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, formed by the Great Compromise, which built our government on portions of both plans. In other words, the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan were two plans. One represented larger states, the other represented smaller states. But the Great Compromise came about and made it possible for both large and small states to have representation in the Congress. Large states, or states no matter how large or small, would be given 2 senators. There would be within the states districts where representatives would be elected as congressmen to represent their respective state districts. And that came about as a result of the Great Compromise. And this built our government. And so our government is based on compromise. When the time comes to elect a new president or re-elect the one we have, the campaigns are based on what has occurred over the previous 4 years. The country runs from the lowest level of government, the precinct, to the highest level of government, the presidency. We all have a stake in it. No one is left out unless they don't participate. The greatest way to participate, or most basic way, is to become a registered voter when you reach your 18th year. I am a voter registrar, so I can help people register to vote. In a country which prizes the right to vote, on whose vote the government depends, it is alarming that the voter turnout in elections is so low. It should be 100% turnout at every election, at every level of government, because at every level it is, as it must be, and can only be, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. If we ever perish from the earth, it will be because we gave up. Never give up on your country. It is not merely for today, said Abraham Lincoln, but for all time to come, that we should perpetuate for our children's children this great and free government, which we have enjoyed all our lives. I beg you to remember this. May we long remember, so we may long endure. We will always remember, so that we may always be free. The president is the head of state, and meets all the leaders of the nations of the world. If they don't come to him, he'll go to them, flying on that great big plane known as Air Force One, with the words United States of America boldly painted on the side. The president is both head of state, the nation, and head of the government. Unlike as in England, the prime minister is head of the government, but the queen is head of the state. The English have a divided government between two leaders. We Americans have one leader, but two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, with two differing notions of how government should run, based on two differing philosophies of government, hence divided government. So in a sense, we have divided government too. The government of the United States is outlined in the Constitution of the United States. James Madison, our fourth president, is credited as having contributed the most to its writing. He and the other framers looked to philosophers of government such as John Locke and Charles Montesquieu for a framework of governing. They came up with a two-house legislature, the Congress, a single man-occupied presidency, the executive branch, and a Supreme Court and lower courts, the judicial branch. Each branch has been given expressed powers, but each branch acts as a check upon the other's power and how it is exercised. This could be called the Madisonian concept of government because he was the chief architect of the Constitution. Woodrow Wilson, in his 1885 Congressional Government book, thought that the Madisonian system, a balance of powers, was too extreme and called this a radical defect. We mentioned a while ago that it is the president alone who must make the final decision upon a national policy matter. Wilson posed that the checks and balances system would make it difficult to give the American government an adequate decision-making process. Wilson was a great admirer of the British-style cabinet form of government, in which the president would essentially function as a prime minister. But when he became president, he realized the founders gave us a better system. He believed a strong presidency can give the nation the leadership it deserves. The president is the man on whose shoulders rests the burden of leadership and decision. The president represents you and me when he shakes hands with foreign leaders. Most other nations of the world have kings, prime ministers, queens, princes, premiers, and yes, even military dictators who preside over military governments. Some too have presidents, but none of them are as the President of the United States. Many nations of Europe and Asia have leaders who come from bloodlines of families that have ruled their lands for centuries. Here we have no ruling class or family dynasty, although we've come close with the Roosevelts and the Kennedys and the Bushes. For the most part, our leaders come from ordinary families, just the same as you and me. We have no ruling class here. Our leaders come from every family in the land, and from every family in the land makes up this great country of ours. We have a democracy in the sense that the people rule by their votes. We have a republic in the sense that through our votes, we elect representatives to speak for us. This government of ours must be preserved in spite of the acts of any man or set of men. We must not become an oligarchy, the rule of a few. We must not become a plutocracy, the rule of the rich. We must remain a democracy and maintain the ideal that nowhere else in the world is there a government of so much liberty and independence. To the humblest amongst us are held the highest positions. The bulwark of our liberty and independence is the love of liberty, and our defense is in the spirit which prizes liberty as the sacred heritage of all peoples, in all lands everywhere. This is the spirit which defends against the onslaught of despotism. Self-government is the toughest form of government, but it is the best form of government. It is tough because it requires work, and there are winners and losers, but it is the best system because we are the rulers over ourselves. The word is not spoken over us by a dictator. The word is proclaimed by an entire free people that tells the world, here is the way to freedom. Here is the way to peace. We are a government of laws and not of men, because we obey the laws passed over us by our elected leaders, and they too must follow the laws they make. Sometimes there is conflict between the three branches of government, and this is a kind of built-in conflict which some observers say ensures our political freedom. This conflict keeps each branch equal to the other so that no one branch becomes too powerful over the other. This ingenious system of checks and balances allows no one to become a tyrant and lets no group prevail unless their cause is tempered by a true concern for the governed. Our forefathers fought the revolution to make sure we would not have to live under a king, but under law. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and all the laws passed in pursuance of the Constitution and under the Constitution, as written in Article 6, Paragraph 2, the supreme law of the land. The Congress makes the law, the President enforces the law, or makes suggestions for legislation, as in his State of the Union address. And of course, the Supreme Court interprets the laws. At times, there is conflict between the President and Congress concerning the law, but then they compromise. There is also the Supreme Court to say what the law is, as Chief Justice John Marshall so famously said. There can also be amendments added to the Constitution or replaced, taken out of the Constitution. This all occurs throughout the history and experience of a people who are our nation. A nation is a geographic place with a people who have a common heritage, speak a common language, share the same borders, and live under the same government. We've been studying the Presidency of the United States, the office which is the leader of the executive branch of government. There are two other offices or leaders of government: the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, whose real title, official title, is the Chief Justice of the United States, Mr. John Roberts, the Honorable John Roberts. He is the highest justice in the land, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Representative Nancy Pelosi. She is the highest officer of the legislative branch of our government. The President, unlike the other two, is not only the head of one branch of government, but the head of the entire government of the United States. We've had some great presidents, such as George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Ronald Reagan. We've also had some great Chief Justices, John Jay, John Marshall, and Earl Warren. We have had some great speakers of the House of Representatives. The first one was Frederick A.C. Muhlenberg, Sam Rayburn, and Carl Albert, and John McCormick, and Thomas P. Tip O'Neill, Thomas P. O'Neill Jr., and Newt Gingrich, and Richard A. Gephardt. I remember when I was visiting Washington, D.C. years ago as a kid, and we had tickets to sit in the balcony of the House of Representatives to look at the House well. And at that time, the Speaker of the House was Thomas P. O'Neill, and I saw him sitting on the rostrum observing the business of the House of Representatives at that time. It was back in the summer of 1985 when I visited Washington for the first time. This is what we need to know as citizens of this country of ours. And we need to know our civics. Citizen knowledge and participation in the life of our country is the way to strengthen our national unity. The Constitution provides an outline of our government, and of course the presidency in Article 2, and it is also true that many of our presidents have established precedents of power and custom, and this contributes to the growth and development of the presidency as an institution. When he was a young man of 18 years old, Harry Truman ran almost 3 blocks to see and hear the first president of the United States he ever saw in person. This was in Kansas City, Missouri, probably in the year 1902. Theodore Roosevelt was president at that time. He saw and heard Theodore Roosevelt. And after he himself became president, Truman would often tell that story. He would always say, "I'll never forget the thrill I got when, upon seeing the man who represented the government of the United States in person." That was at that time, Theodore Roosevelt, the current 26th President of the United States, and the future 33rd President of the United States, Harry Truman. The future 42nd President of the United States, Bill Clinton, shook the hand of the then current 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, at a Rose Garden ceremony when the young Clinton was a member of Boys Nation. So you see, my fellow Americans, an American boy can grow up to be the American president. It's true for girls, too. In this country, any one of us, if we're dedicated enough and love our country enough and are old enough and get enough votes, can become the President of the United States and preside over the greatest government ever devised by the genius of man and blessed by the providence of God. Now, who are some of our great presidents on this President's Day? Well, the greatest president of all time are the ones who made great contributions to the history and development of our country. There are at least 9 of them. First, of course, is George Washington, who was president from 1789 to 1797. And he oversaw the debates of the Federal Convention, which forged our Constitution in 1787, and in turn became our first president of the United States. During Washington's presidency, the Departments of State, Treasury, War, and Justice were formed. The Supreme Court first sat for its session, and the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were ratified. This is the document known as the Bill of Rights. Across the sea, France was in the midst of her revolution and was at war with Prussia and Austria. The first U.S. Census showed a population of 3,929,214 citizens, and the flag added 2 new stars with the admittance into the Union of Vermont, the 14th state, and Kentucky, the 15th state. And the flag I have behind me is the first flag of the United States, representing the first 13 states of the Union, the former 13 colonies. And that flag behind me flew over our country from 1777 to 1795. Thomas Jefferson, our third president, from 1801 to 1809, made the government more democratic, and he wisely enlarged the country with the purchase of Louisiana Territory, west of the Mississippi, and this gave our country more land. The Louisiana Territory, acquired from France for $15 million, doubled the size of the country. And Andrew Jackson, the 7th president, from 1829 to 1837. He was the first Democratic president. He was the first president elected by the Democratic Party, and he continued expanding the idea of popular government. He was for the common man and stood opposed to the special interests, as in the Bank of the United States. He didn't want one power controlling the wealth of the country. James K. Polk, the 11th president, from 1845 to 1849. Now, he brought the country all the way to the Pacific coast. Under Polk, we achieved our manifest destiny. As with France, we only had to pay money, but to get more of our land this time, we had to fight a war with Mexico. Right, with France, we just paid $15 million. But to get more land, we had to fight a war, the Mexican War, from 1846 to 1848. It was during those years when Abraham Lincoln was a young congressman from Illinois. He was opposed to the war with Mexico, but he was very patriotic for the soldier and their needs. Through struggle and conflict, we expanded our dominion of Columbia, the bright gem of the ocean. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. America became a continental power, and we started our first great steps toward growth into the greatest republic in history. Both Jefferson and Polk built this country into a continental power. Polk was also the Speaker of the House of Representatives from 1835 to 1839, when Jackson and Van Buren were president. He was also the governor of Tennessee, 1839 to 1841. James K. Polk, one of our most unknown presidents, and yet really in his day one of our most famous and most successful, because he accomplished everything he promised he would do. He accomplished everything he said he would in the campaign. He was both a state governor and head of the legislative branch as Speaker of the House, and of course head of the executive branch as our 11th president. Another president of ours, William Howard Taft, later became the Chief Justice of the United States. Polk and Taft had the rare opportunities to serve as heads of 2 different branches of our government at different times in their careers. And Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president, from 1861 to 1865. He was a member of Congress, as I mentioned, representing Illinois during Polk's presidency. Lincoln did not favor the war with Mexico, but when Lincoln became president in 1861, he had another war on his hands, the Civil War. Lincoln did 2 great things as president. He saved the Union of all the states, and he abolished the institution of slavery. Slavery in our country had always been something of a dilemma. It was one of the causes of the Civil War, division between northern states and southern states. The Civil War was, to some extent, the price we paid for slavery. But the war's victory made our country whole again, and forever free, and forever one, and undivided. We could have split up into various geographical sections of the country with divided and subdivided allegiances. We did not submerge, divided, and conquered. We emerged, one country, under one flag, as one people, truly the land of e pluribus unum, one out of many. The presidents who followed Lincoln in the White House, the executive mansion, did you know it was always referred to as the president's house or the executive mansion, but really not until around the time of Theodore Roosevelt was it known as the White House. The presidents that followed Lincoln were severely limited in their control of government. Congress was the branch in control after the age of Lincoln. The Constitution sets up the three separate branches of government and gives each branch a certain amount of authority, and that authority is checked by the authority of the other branches of government. This, however, does not stop conflict between the branches, and sometimes one branch can become too authoritative. When that happens, times are difficult, but not so difficult because we have never seen the day under God, and under God we will never see the day when tyranny and despotism overtake the government. In fact, we just went through a very painful impeachment and trial of a president, and over 150 years ago, Andrew Johnson went through the same thing because he was at odds with Congress over the Reconstruction Plan of the defeated South. But he was acquitted by one vote. The name of that senator was Edmund G. Ross, and his courageous story of taking a brave political stand is recorded in Chapter 6 of a book called Profiles in Courage, written by Senator John F. Kennedy, later President John F. Kennedy. Lincoln had, as president, expanded his powers as the chief executive due to the problems and pressures of the Civil War. With the Reconstruction challenges, helping the South to rebuild, and the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, the president who took over after Lincoln's assassination, the presidency receded in power and Congress grew in power. And a young scholar of political economy and a future president, Woodrow Wilson, wrote a book in the 1880s entitled Congressional Government. In it, he chronicled the years after the Civil War and described how Congress reasserted power and control. It was particularly controlled by the radical wing of the Republican Party, that branch of Lincoln's party that wanted to enforce a harsh peace on the defeated South. And this is something Lincoln, I don't think, would have approved. In the 1880s, Grover Cleveland was the first Democratic president since James Buchanan, and I thought that for a long time. But in reality, Andrew Johnson was himself, by political allegiance, a lifelong Southern Democrat. The reason why he became Lincoln's vice president was because Lincoln awarded him that position because he was the only senator of the South to remain loyal to the Union at the time of the Southern secession movement. He was appointed governor or military governor of a portion of Tennessee that quickly fell under Union control early in the war, and then was chosen to be Lincoln's vice president for the 1864 ticket, which really wasn't the Republican ticket. It was called the National Union ticket because Johnson was really a Democrat. So he really, in a sense, was the first Democrat after Lincoln. But then years later, Grover Cleveland became the first Democrat since James Buchanan, or we could say since Andrew Johnson. Cleveland began to reassert the presidential leadership role in governing. He restored the presidency to its proper place in the constitutional framework of our self-government. After 5 presidents before him, Johnson, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, and Arthur, whose powers were greatly limited, Cleveland began to restore presidential power, authority, and influence. Grover the Good did all he could until he died saying, "I have tried so hard to do good." Cleveland was a chief executive at the municipal level of government as well. He was mayor of Buffalo, New York in the 1880s. At the dawn of the 20th century came rough-riding Theodore Roosevelt, and he started the program of putting the government of the United States out of the hands of the great exploiters of wealth and placing it back into the hands of the people in what he called the New Nationalism. Woodrow Wilson, who served as the 28th president from 1913 to 1921, was our president, as I say, 100 years ago. His philosophy was titled The New Freedom. This was the Democratic version of the Republican Theodore Roosevelt, his New Nationalism. Basically, both Wilson and Roosevelt's philosophy were known as Progressivism, the idea that it was the responsibility of the government to help society become reformed and better. This is a good idea in itself, but some people think It is dangerous to give the government more and more powers because, according to another philosophy, our government was meant to be small and limited in its power. And this is the whole concept of our Constitution. This is the whole concept of our Constitution, as some would argue. I tend to argue it as a constitutionalist. I am in agreement with that argument, that view of the Constitution. I guess I would be a strict constructionist of the Constitution. Progressivism, it had well intentions, but of course, today, in today's viewpoint, it's rather dangerous because it tends to focus too much on the powers of the federal government. And Woodrow Wilson once said, "The irony of fate, if my administration were to deal chiefly with foreign affairs." He said this because he was intent on being a president with a reform program for domestic affairs, meaning he was concerned about what he could do best for our country and let the world alone. But times were changing. The European powers were at war, again, for the first time in 100 years in Europe. What was America to do? Become involved or remain neutral? America finally entered the war in 1917. If Wilson had not been forced into war, he would be remembered chiefly today as a domestic reform president. After the war, when he was working on the peace treaty of Versailles with the other world leaders, he tried his utmost to set up a new world order of peace so that there would not be any more wars to fight in the future. This has been tried time and again throughout history. King Henry IV of France tried a plan like this in the 16 or 1700s. Wilson tried nobly in his turn, but was not successful on account of isolationists in the Senate who did not see America as a world political power. Wilson foresaw a great role for America in the world as a defender of peace and liberty and the majesty of right. This vision was largely ahead of its time, but it set the stage for future American leadership in the world. This ideal of American leadership in world affairs has become known as Wilsonianism. And it is interesting to note that a future Republican president, Richard Nixon, was a great admirer of Woodrow Wilson. And his attempts at diplomatic initiatives in his administration, in his term of office, were inspired by Wilson's great dream of world peace and order. I kind of chuckled to myself in a public speech Nixon gave about Wilson. Well, he said that the greatness of Woodrow Wilson was that his vision was largely ahead of his time. Nixon kind of made a gaffe, and he when he was mentioning the name Woodrow Wilson, he said Goodrow Wilson, but then he immediately corrected himself and said Woodrow Wilson. For 13 years, between 1921 and 1933, we had 3 good but very conservative, non-government involved presidents: Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. And I always used to think that those presidents were boring and weren't good guys, but now that I've become more conservative, I kind of understand where they're coming from. But I still have an admiration for President Wilson and President Franklin Roosevelt. But these presidents, between Wilson and Roosevelt, they were all Republicans, and they were pro-business and free market thinkers, and I'm certainly pro-business and free market. This is not bad or wrong. In fact, it is these ideas, for the most part, that produces our national wealth. The Republican Party has for a long time been the party associated with big business. In fact, Calvin Coolidge was heard to say, "The business of America is business." The notion of the Republican Party as the party of big business had its roots in the administration of Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd president from 1889 to 1893. This is due in part to Harrison's support of a high protective tariff. This was supported by many business leaders of the time because it gave them more support to grow in their businesses. A tariff is a tax on imported goods to decrease their influence, to decrease the influence on imported goods and increase the influence on domestic products, which would be good for our domestic economy. It encourages people to buy American, and thus it is hoped to generate more wealth for the country. By 1933, when Franklin D. Roosevelt became our 32nd president, times were tough economically for the country. It had suffered economic depressions before, and some were even far worse than the fall of the stock market of 1929. But this time, the effect was worldwide, and the people looked to a man who had been schooled in progressivism and used the government to come to the aid of its people. Franklin Roosevelt followed in the tradition of strong presidential leadership and with his New Deal and put Americans back to work. With the Depression quelled came another challenge, another world conflict, after which we emerged victorious, and we had no alternative but to accept the mantle of world leadership, the fulfillment of Wilson's vision for America. Roosevelt's vice president, Harry S. Truman of Missouri, picked up the standard and carried on and moved our nation to the fore of leadership. The United Nations, the successor to the League of Nations, became the organization to help the nations of the world to achieve a world of peace, which is always a continuing challenge. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was an association of Western democracies to defend against the spread of a new enemy, communism. President Truman saw America victorious at the end of the Second World War. He made the decisions to strengthen us in this fight against communism, known as the Cold War, the conflict between the communist world, led by the Soviet Union, and the free world, led by the United States. And the march of our presidents goes forward. Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, George Walker Bush, Barack Obama, and now Donald Trump. Hail to the chiefs, for they in triumph advance. A big portion of our political debate today is between liberalism and conservatism. What we need to remember is that what we call conservatism today is the liberalism that founded America. What we call liberalism today is something that came out of the progressive movement of the 1890s through to the start of the First World War in 1914. This philosophy, while well-intended, and it did help address many areas of social concern, it has, I think, led to some extent to the intrusiveness and bigness of our federal government. The conservatism today, the great-great-grandson of the liberalism, the classic liberalism of our nation's founding, seeks to reduce the influence of government and restore to the people at the subsidiary levels of government the sovereignty that keeps us free. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, the ends of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation upon such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. These words are from our Declaration of Independence. These words are the founding of our country, and they present the classical liberal philosophy of limited government. The chief duty of government is to protect the rights of its citizens, rights not given by the government, but by the Creator, our Heavenly Father. A limited, wise, and frugal government is the keystone of the arch of freedom, while bigger and bigger government is dangerous to our liberty and freedom. Over the last 75 to 80 years, our government has expanded in its powers, in its influence, and with its power to tax and spend without limits. This is intrusive to the point of totalitarianism, a form of rule in which the government is involved in every aspect of our lives. This is social engineering, and it is not freedom. It is not the kind of government our founding fathers sought and for which our patriots fought. Within our two-party system, we have liberal and conservative wings. The Democrats have left-wing and center philosophies of government, as do the Republicans. The Republicans also have a wing which is very conservative. This has been a continual factor in our political life. The deepest division we had was the Civil War, an armed conflict between the North and the South in the United States. The political divide was between the Southern Democrats and the newly formed Republican Party, leagued with Northern Democrats and Free Soilers. From the Civil War until about 1968, the South was heavily Democratic, and no Democratic candidate for president could have any hope of winning the presidency unless he won the electoral votes of the Southern states. The last Democrat to win the solid South was Jimmy Carter in 1976. The South has always been conservative and is now more Republican than Democrat. Donald Trump won every Southern state except Virginia, and he, of course, was the Republican candidate. This is what we might call the demography of democracy. Political differences in the country can be a bad thing if they create and fester deep, abiding divisions which scar the union of our country for decades. Political differences are in our control. See, political differences don't have to control us. We can control them. If we remember that across the gulfs and barriers that divide us, there are no permanent enemies. We are one nation and one people. Political differences can be used as a tool to get all points of view spoken and heard, from which we can create a consensus, an agreement based on a little bit of everyone's viewpoint. To look at the politics of the day from the viewpoint of one party or another, one section of the country or another, one ethnic or racial group or another, is but to really see the country from various points of view, and yet to see it as a whole. Each group within our country has different obstacles and different goals, shaped from the vagaries of their own history and experience. The one essential fact we need bear in mind is that we are all Americans, and our history is a common heritage for each generation of Americans, which has learned that while there may have been slave ships and immigrant ships, Indians and settlers, there is still the light of liberty that has led and guided us all through our history, and it is only this light that can scatter the darkness. It is only the flag of freedom that can fly triumphant on the hilltop, whether it be Bunker Hill or Mount Suribachi. Self-government is the toughest way of life. The only thing tougher we could be living under is a dictator. But we chose long ago not to live under a dictator. We chose to live as free men on that great and glorious day, July 4th, 1776, living under the rule of our fellow free citizens, whom we elect from among our own ranks. We all have our turn to be rulers and ruled through the mightiest and greatest determinant of rule, and that is the freedom of the hallowed form of the free election. For it is by the votes of the precincts of every township, in each county, in every state, all over our country, cast by the people called citizens, that elects our president. You see, Mr. Citizen is just like you and me, and Mr. Citizen can become Mr. President. We are all fellow citizens in this great republic, and each one of us is given the opportunity by right and by duty to make our contribution when we were born under this stars and stripes of ours. And my fellow countrymen, let us continue to make the kind of contributions that God intended us to make when we were born under this stars and stripes of ours. My fellow countrymen, happy President's Day. May God bless all our presidents, our president today, and our presidents into the future. Thank you, and good night.